Leading up to Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution, Cuba did not embody the utopia later nostalgically envisioned by many of its exiles, nor did it resemble the dire state depicted by some revolution supporters. Instead, Cuba stood out as one of the most advanced and prosperous nations in Latin America. In 1958, it ranked as the 29th largest economy globally. However, after the course of 60 years, Cuba's citizens find themselves struggling to meet basic food necessities. The average real salary in Cuba, as of 2019, barely reached $35 per month. The question arises: how did Cuba squander its once prominent potential? So let's discover the reasons for the economic collapse of Cuba. Before we start, please support my channel by clicking like and subscribe buttons. In the 1920s, Cuba earned a reputation as an alluring and permissive haven, attracting robber barons and bohemians alike. Esteemed figures like the Whitneys, Biltmores, and even New York City Mayor Jimmy "Bill" James Walker made the island their preferred destination for indulging in winter activities, such as gambling, horse racing, golfing, and country clubbing. While sugar remained Cuba's economic backbone, its tropical allure, coupled with captivating individuals, transformed American tourism into a natural and lucrative revenue stream. By the 1950s, luminaries like Ava Gardner, Frank Sinatra, and Ernest Hemingway graced Cuba with their presence. The advent of affordable flights and hotel packages democratized the once exclusive hotspot, allowing the American masses to partake in the experience for a mere $50, a sum equivalent to a few $100s today, for round-trip tickets from Miami, inclusive of accommodations, food, and entertainment. This accessibility brought about significant economic growth in Cuba. Havana, the capital, stood as a glittering and dynamic city in 1958. With 358 cinemas, it surpassed New York and Paris in cinematic offerings. The streets were filled with cars, totaling approximately 160,000, making Cuba's capital surpass all of Brazil in automobile density, boasting one car for every 38 inhabitants. The literacy rate stood at 76%, ranking as the fourth highest in Latin America, and Cuba claimed the 11th spot globally in the number of doctors per capita. However, beneath the surface of prosperity, profound societal inequalities persisted in Cuba. Disparities existed between urban and rural areas, as well as between white and black populations. In the countryside, some Cubans lived in dire poverty exacerbated by seasonal sugar production. Maqueteros, sugarcane cutters working only 4 months a year, became a marginalized army of unemployed, burdened by perpetual debt. Many impoverished peasants suffered from severe malnourishment and hunger, with limited access to healthcare and education. Illiteracy was pervasive, and those fortunate enough to attend school rarely progressed beyond the first or second grades. Additionally, the regime of then-President of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, particularly during its second term from 1952 to 1959, was characterized by corruption, political repression, and a lack of democratic institutions. The government's oppressive tactics and disregard for civil liberties fueled discontent among various segments of the population. In 1958, appalled by the brutality of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, the United States discontinued military assistance to his regime. The turning point came in 1959 when Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces entered Havana, prompting President Batista and his family to flee the country. By mid-February 1959, Castro assumed the role of prime minister and initiated measures aimed at redistributing wealth and garnering support in rural areas. In May, an Agricultural Reform Act was enacted, placing restrictions on the size of most farm holdings to fewer than 1,000 acres. This action led to the dissolution of the largest holdings, including U.S.-owned sugar properties, some of which exceeded 400,000 acres. Land was distributed among thousands of rural workers, and the government implemented improvements on the large farms under its control. Washington demanded a review of agricultural reform and, upon receiving a refusal, declared a reduction in the supply of oil, industrial goods, and food to Cuba, and also denied credits for industrialization.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
In June 1960, Castro nationalized oil refineries owned by North Americans, and in August-October, he nationalized sugar mills, factories, railways, major trading enterprises, and banks. On April 16, 1961, the socialist nature of the Cuban Revolution was officially proclaimed. Thus, by the early 1960s, a planned regulated state economy was introduced in the country, unemployment was eliminated, and certain social problems were addressed. A literacy campaign in 1961 sent thousands of young volunteers to rural areas. The government also began building hundreds of new schools and training thousands of additional teachers. Healthcare was extended to the entire population for the first time with the construction of rural clinics and hospitals. Many private and racially segregated facilities, such as clubs and beaches, were open to the public. Faced with resistance from an outraged and deceived Washington, Castro immediately moved closer to Moscow and adopted a communist rhetoric. As a consequence of this action, the U.S. banned all imports from Cuba. As Cuba lost its main importer, it turned completely to the former USSR. The determination to end dependence on sugar production took the extreme form of plowing over vast acreage of sugar lands and planting new crops. But these efforts largely failed due to the lack of expertise and appropriate climatic conditions. During the 1960s, the Cuban government also borrowed a strategy of heavy industrialization from the Soviet Union, but these efforts yielded only limited success because of Cuba's particular conditions and the lack of trained personnel. It was realized that economic independence from the Soviet Union could not be achieved in the short run. The shortcomings of the economic initiatives in the 1960s compelled the Cuban leadership to reluctantly acknowledge that the most feasible economic strategy was to pivot towards economic integration with the East European Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, commonly known as COMECA. This organization, led by the Soviet Union, consisted of countries in the Eastern Bloc and several socialist states globally. Joining COMECON meant that Cuba would primarily focus on producing sugar, nickel, and citrus products in exchange for oil, manufactured goods, and canned foods. Cuba also received a particularly favorable exchange rate on Soviet oil for its sugar. Consequently, this setup shielded Cuba from the substantial surge in world energy prices between 1973 and 1982, which had devastating effects on many third world economies. The USSR extended support to Cuba through various means, including subsidies, debt assistance, deferment of debt payment schedules, and purchasing Cuban exports at high prices. During this period, the Cuban consumer did not consistently experience direct benefits from the overall economic growth due to the country's primary focus on exports. Nevertheless, the revolutionary wealth redistribution policies resulted in a significant sharing of the advantages of COMECON membership. By the close of the 1980s, Cuba had established one of the most egalitarian societies globally, characterized by the absence of malnutrition and hunger. However, even at the peak of Cuba's prosperity, the Cuban consumer still faced challenges in terms of limited variety and quality of available goods. Profound transformations began in Cuba with the collapse of the Soviet Union. These events had a profound impact on Cuba because at the outset of 1989, nearly all of the country's foreign trade, totaling 85%, was conducted with the Soviet Union and other socialist nations within the COMECON. Cuba heavily relied on the COMECON for energy supplies, fertilizer, machine tools, and canned foods. By 1993, Cuba had experienced a 75% reduction in its import capacity, leading to a 40% contraction in economic activity. No modern economy had faced such devastation in the 20th century outside the context of war. This economic downturn resulted in the reinstatement of rationing for essential goods. Despite the economic crisis, Castro ensured that medical facilities and schools remained operational. To generate immediate hard currency, a concerted effort to significantly expand the tourism industry was initiated, despite accompanying social issues such as drugs and prostitution. However, the U.S. embargo persisted, limiting Cuba's ability to realize its full economic growth potential. In the 2000s, Cuba established fruitful economic ties with oil-rich Venezuela, leading to a remarkable average growth rate of 5.6% during that period. However, the growth rate declined to 2.1% from 2010 onward, as the Venezuelan economy spiraled into chaos. In January 2021, Donald Trump became the 12th U.S. president to leave office without achieving the removal of the Cuban embargo. Since 2019, Cuba's access to food and fuel has once again been severely hampered, resulting in reduced export earnings and a deterrent to foreign investors. Measures to address the COVID-19 pandemic demanded additional resources, leading to the closure of the economy and a sharp decline in tourism revenues as borders were sealed. Goods shortages on the island have made long, exhausting queues a daily reality, with Cubans queuing up as early as 4 a.m. Cuba's GDP experienced an 11% decline in 2020, nearly one-third of the total drop the island faced during the special period between 1990 and 1993 following the collapse of the Soviet bloc. Despite the significant reforms implemented by the Cuban government following the collapse of the USSR, the overall economy remains largely under state control. In 2023, inflation has surged at a rate of 45%, following a 39% increase in the previous year, 2022. In an attempt to curb inflation, Cuba has increased price controls, but these measures have achieved little success so far. That's it for today. Thanks for your time. Please do not forget to support my channel by clicking like and subscribe buttons.